Alrighty, it's about time for us to begin. And so if you would go ahead and get settled in, you'll want to have a couple things ready and on the open. Number one, you'll certainly want your Bible. We're still kind of paying attention to part of the closing sections of the text of Judges and Ruth, which we'll quickly overview as well. And then I'll get you nervous right now because after that we're going to have a pop quiz. It's self-graded, and so I don't think it'll be too concerned with your performance. There'll be no grade reports, but it is a surprise, non-announced review, if you will, of Judges and a little bit before and a little bit after. But with that, let's begin our time together this morning with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that we find in Jesus. We thank you for your word and its capacity to reveal to us your nature, your character, and your goals. Help us as followers of Christ who are stewards of your grace to manifest the life of Christ and grace first to ourselves and then to all. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so again, we are looking at the downward spiral of Israel as they go from the high emotional point of the conquest closings of Joshua, where we have that, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, double-pronged meaning that certainly has his family expectations laid out. But as we contemplate their future, we know that they, as Israel as a whole, essentially does not follow the Lord. Individually, that might be a different case, but as a community, they don't keep the covenant. They do not follow the Lord's expectation. They do not continue to sustain the boundaries of the promised land. They don't keep the land pure and according to the covenant, which then predicates or presupposes all the background for why it is that this spiral takes place. Incrementally, you can see in all of these stories a reflection of the promised curses of the covenant. God withdrawing from them his care and protection, his governance, his abundance. Still giving grace at times and still bringing justice to the land, but certainly not to the extent that was present when they are as a whole following God. And we'll see that return when the tables flip the other direction. And the mass of Israel seems to be led back towards obedience and service. At this point in time, you can kind of remind yourself that there is an increased pressuring of the communities around Israel that are taking place because God is in essence lifting the barrier to a degree. Those surrounding nations that would have been held at bay by the covenant and by God's power are pushing back in to these edging areas. And this is also at the point in time where you see Israel start to turn on itself to a higher degree. If you remember that some of these closing sections are some of the most awful parts of the story of God's people. In the midst of that, God is still taking care of the illustration of his covenant. There's a ton of swirling chaos that takes place in all of these events. And this is all kind of thought in the terms that are the closing of the last named judges, who might also have other roles, and the rise of the first king. The stories that surround the Ark of the Covenant help us kind of capture what God's doing there. And sometimes we make additional application of them. But I want to kind of balance two things here. On the one hand, God cares for the physical representation of the covenant. That's the ark and its contents. What is God's people doing at this time? What are some of these closing stories of the text of Judges like? If you were going to give a shorthanded version of, say, the last 3 chapters of Judges, what's the most polite way you could describe that? Because it's an impolite story. You guys remember what happens there? With the Levite and how he treats his concubine? It's pretty awful, right? I think most folks who I know who are familiar and maybe have recently read this text often will say something like, this has to be the worst part of the Bible to read. In fact, it feels worse to read that story than it does to read the story that surrounds Noah. And the reason I say that is that Noah's story is very general. All their thoughts are evil. That's general, right? It's different because the specific evil that's here is spelled out. It's atrocious. It would fall into the category of an atrocity, and it would certainly be classed as some of the most horrible human-to-human behavior. And it would be even more striking as if it had been an uncommon part of humanity's history. But if you read history, the unfortunate reality is that that is not a one-time kind of event, because throughout history, humanity has treated humanity in essence the same way. There's been multiple instances of this kind of awfulness. Even, I want you to kind of put this in context, leading up to the adopted Roman behavior of putting criminals on a cross. The context of the New Testament and the context of first century history tells us that that type of death was then perceived to be what? Is it a powerful, like a strong sentence? Oh, I'm going to be going to the cross. Do you feel good about your choices at that point, or is there something else? Shame, right? It's supposed to be considered culturally at the context one of the most shameful ways to be put to death in Roman culture. And first century culture probably continued that. And yet, we have this other kind of an execution here where the person's remains are treated as if they are a trophy to rally people to an unjust cause. And so there are a couple of these instances in the Bible like this, and of course the one with the Levite concubine is a replication of an earlier story as well. It kind of echoes an earlier context. These are ones that at times are kind of helping us figure out who God is, but also who we are. The strongest point you can make biblically when you consider the text is this. Every person in the Bible stories, every human, is not that much different than you or me. There's only a few, details that make us different. When we were born and what we know. All of them had the same access to God. So with that caveat, it's really just when we were born. Not much difference between us and those who would have gone to war with David or against him. Context is very similar there to think about all of those things. All right, any quick thoughts about that as we think about what God is doing here? Judges 21:25 gives us a text that ties it together. It's very similar to the closing parts of the story of Noah and the events that lead up to the ark for all created kind. But Judges 21:25 says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's kind of the description factor. In that section, we've got a few more events that takes place. We've got the inter-conflicts between the various parts of Dan, and we see this kind of striking out, upward in this case. They were crowded in their initial allotment there. They failed to take their allotted space of land from the Canaanites. Later, the Philistines would fight for their southern portion. So most of the tribe would move north and plot themselves near Laish. They rename the city later, Dan, after the father of their tribe. During this period of oppression as well, there were righteous people who would be recorded for us. And this is the events that surround Ruth. The story of Ruth is one of the pivotal emotional turning points of the Bible, but also begins to repeat a theme that is counterintuitive. If you were to ask someone this question, hey, who should an Israelite marry? What's their answer to that question based on your understanding of the covenant? Another Israelite, right? And remember, Israelite for us in this context could mean two things. Because eventually we encounter a group of people that we have a term for in the New Testament called proselytes, those who were converted to Israel, but they were not necessarily born by blood into Israel. Paul is another kind of that two-placed person, where he is Roman by birth, but by ethnicity and by faith, he is Jewish. What's interesting here is that we see this instance taking place where in a series of marriages, we have Israelites choosing to marry those who ethnically and nationally had not been part of Israel. What's the thing that ties these two marriages together, both for Boaz's upbringing and then stepping forward into the story of Ruth for the family that forms after that? What seems to be different in the cases of these two women? What early choice do they make that makes them different?
They chose to serve God.
They made a choice to pledge openly, by words and by deeds, to serve Jehovah. They did so in crucial moments in their lives, where on one of them, their life was hanging in the balance, and it would seem that it was self-serving. The other one, their life is hanging in the balance, and it seems self-sacrificial. Because to the one who is inside the city that's about to be taken, in essence, their response there is, well, you're doing that because you're afraid. You've seen that we're powerful. But with the story in Ruth, she's told, just go back to your people. Back to your own kind. If you come with me, it's going to be horrible. It's going to be awful. Nobody's going to want you. Nobody's going to want us. And note, you can kind of see on the map, they're going to be going from this territory near Reuben's land all the way down underneath the Dead Sea and back up again to get to where Boaz is at. By foot, with nothing. And how much nothing do they have? What they can carry with them. So what are they doing when they arrive in Boaz's area? Gleaning from that sounds fancy. Is that like a fancy dinner? Is gleaning like, oh man, I'm going out to the gleaning fest next week. What does that actually mean from your life status standpoint? Getting something to eat off of the edges of the field. You're not a laborer. You're not getting paid. You're not a well-endowed, landholder who can go and gather it. Under the law, they were required to leave stubble with some produce on the end at the edges of the field, and you could go through with the poor, unwashed masses and just get just enough. So now you have someone who has lost their family, lost their land, lost their status, adopted a position with a nation who's not any of their people from blood, and they have no tie anymore other than their commitment, and they're there pulling the dirt off the ground, pulling the food off of the very edges. Now, she is then blessed because of the character of Boaz. Probably with a few other individuals in the Old Testament, if you want to find a good man in the Old Testament story, you're going to have to almost start and end with Boaz. Job 31 is my favorite text in the Old Testament to talk about male morals. But the story of Job underneath it makes it hard to think about Job as a good man, even though he is too. But Boaz, man, we get to see his good. We get to see his compassion. We get to see his mercy. But remember what time frame this is. This is around the same time frame that the Levites have someone in their midst willing to cut up their concubine in order to make a point. I want you to think of, and also understand how the concubine died. Lack of grace. And so, on the one hand, you have the leadership that should be in place for Israel engaging in crimes against humanity. And then you got this guy over here, Boaz, who is seeing someone who's not of Israel, but has committed to Israel, who has nothing to their name other than their potential inheritance, which is kind of a tie-in to whom Jesus' inheritance is. There's like a thematic thing if you want to think about it. And how they treat that family of two that comes in. Boaz then serves to us as an illustration of whom we can be, even when the world around us is as bad as it can be. And how we should treat people who do not necessarily present to us as being much of anything. Because out of their family unit, well, that brings us eventually to David. Which brings us eventually to Jesus. So much so that they make it into the lineage accounts in the New Testament. They're recorded there for us for all time. It's a pretty cool story to close off with. I always like to make sure if I'm going to have to talk about the end of Judges, I get to talk about the beginning of what happens next, because it clears the palate in the best way possible. All right, so that had set us up. We've talked a little bit already in the past, and we'll talk some more probably next week or at the end of class today regarding Samuel and Eli and their impact as individuals who start to serve in this transition role from the closure of these militaristic judges / warriors / warlords into the rise of the prophets, which will also bring us to a phrase that we'll see often in your Old Testament readings from the sons of the prophets. Note that that's not talking about blood heritage. It's talking about all those who would work with one of the prophets. It's sometimes translated the school of the prophets as a indication that this is partly training, but also partly calling. And so we're going to start seeing that group rise up as a kind of the contextual follow-ons to some of the things that happened in the past. All right, Book of Judges. It fits into the books of history spacing. It's because it is, in the end, a history book. Judges isn't a history book in the sense of our history books, because it doesn't follow a numbered chronology. It follows other key indicators to lay these events out. But it is similar to Ruth, to Samuel of the first. Also point this out, and you probably already remember this. We've broken Samuel down into 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. But in their original context, in the time of Christ even, it's just Samuel. And it's just Chronicles. But that would just have a whole lot more chapters. And so over time, because of the length of scrolls and other factors, they just trimmed it down to 2 books versus 1, but it's the same. Judges then fits into a 300-year time period. Some of the most standard chronologies suggest it's around 1350 to 1050 BC or BCE. Again, that's approximate, because to a certain degree, especially with a lot of the events in Judges, we're trying to kind of figure out where it could have been based on other factors. But it's probably a good consideration of that. Let's see here. Thinking through where all these take place, we're going to be covering and have seen that this actually represents events that take place nearly from, this is a phrase you'll see in the historical writings and the prophets, from Dan to Beersheba. That also means top to bottom. That also means from every corner of the map. So if you want to get your biblical terminology going on and you're covering the whole thing, you can just say, well, I've been from Dan to Beersheba today. That means you've been everywhere, man. That's kind of what the phrase means. And so you see that here in the map as you're thinking about where all these things tend to lay themselves out and the major aspects of their roles as judges. Obviously, this is not all of them, because in part some of the judges aren't given a specific area upon which they act. And as we noted before, this probably is your summary passage. So if you're going to have one passage to think about the text of Judges as its conclusion, that's what it is. So let's back up. We have that earlier listing I showed you at the beginning of class. And I want to think a little bit about everything that kind of happens here. So that's interesting. The timing and orders got all reversed. That'll probably happen about 10 more times this morning. That's fine. So we think about this. Primary respondent to Othniel as judge is going to be Cushan-Rishathaim from Mesopotamia. That's the area between the rivers, the middle spot between the rivers. So that puts it on the map. If you're thinking about looking at your map here and Israel is right in front of your eyes, you reach your hand up and you're tapping on Mesopotamia. If you use your left hand and you reach down, that's when you're tapping over there on Egypt. And so you're looking at these people coming from all the way up here. 8 years, primary tribes affected is going to be the half-tribe of Manasseh, 40 years, and 40 years of peace. The son-in-law to Caleb. In this context, we begin to see the spiritual degradation of Israel take place as they forget God and begin to serve the various forms of Baal. One of the plurals for that is identified here, Baalim, and so that's a plural form of these various types of pagan gods. Our next judge will be interacting with the Moabites, do so for 18 years or so, predominantly affect the Benjamites, Ephraim, Gad, and Reuben, be centered around the city of Palms, which is located right above our Dead Sea space. It becomes a major city in that regard. And the land had rest for 80 years, and this takes place. This would be our next judge in sequence, Ehud. And so you've got this story that takes place. It's identified as being a left-handed man. But I want you to note that this indicates to us by the way this word is used here, that he's trained to be able to use his left hand as well as his right hand. The same word is used to describe the left-handed slingers who are specialists in the army of David, who also were trained in fighting with their left hand, and they're from the same area. There's a number of reasons why being able to fight with both of your hands is valuable. Some of it is strategic. If you think in the way in which a spiral staircase functions, it's a very common way in which they get up and down in embankments and fortifications in this time of history. And you think, now, if I was going to fight up and down a cylinder shape or even in a column inside of a small structure and have one side have a shield or a shield wall carrier, then being able to fight offhanded, it's much like thinking about how a pitcher and a batter can work. If you're able to switch out, if you've got a really strong right-handed batter and you're able to switch out your pitcher and make it harder on him to get a hit, you do that. But a few batters are ambidextrous. And actually, in some cases, there's a few batters in history who are able to actually bat better in their non-dominant hand than they were in their dominant hand. And that's Ehud. In addition, of the stories in the text of Judges, this one, like the rest of them, is a little bit dirty and nasty because where the events take place indicate to us that this is, in essence, the job what we would call today, he's an assassin. He has one goal. His goal is to get in there by means of subterfuge and kill the oppressor. When Alan and I were visiting the site of Jericho and standing up there in the blazing hot sun, behind our backs and down the hill about 40 yards is where about it all took place. Now it looks like a big dirt mound in that place where his fortress is identified to have been. But this is where this all plays out. And so we've got our left-handed, but more likely to be easy understood, left-hand skilled assassin who fashions his own weapon, basically hides it on his thigh in a position they wouldn't expect to find it, and is successful in that task. Our next judge who comes into play is going to be focused on the enemy of the Philistines. He will kill 600 of them with an ox goad. Here's the question, the Jeopardy type question. Who is this judge? Our ox goad guy is going to be Shamgar. He's got a cool name, right? This is another one of those things that probably is not going to be made into a movie. Like, Judges itself, it'd probably do well if it was a literal interpretation of Judges, but I doubt they're going to be showing literal renditions of this anytime soon. But Shamgar makes his appearance here. Up next, our judge will be interacting directly with the Canaanites, specifically Jabin and Sisera. About 20 years, it will involve the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. It'll be centered on Mount Tabor. So if you're looking at your map and you find Mount Tabor, there will be a 40-year period of judgeship and a 40-year period of peace. And who is our dynamic duo of judges? One real judge and one who could have been a judge. Yeah. The story has played out. It could have been one way. It ended up being another way. The Bible actually shows human agency in response to God's plan in this case and shows how he will work things through. Also, this is one of the many instances where if you start thinking about you want a biblical wife, gentlemen, realize you've got to make sure to be clear what you mean, because women in the Bible across the board as wives often do all of the strong and meritorious things that men do. And so a biblical wife not only is Proverbs 31, but she may also be in Judges, making sure that she does what God asked her to do. And that's not all soft and mushy. It's tough, strong and bold. All those things are there. Our next judge focused in on dealing with the Midianites and the Amalekites for about 7 years. Primary space there is in Jezreel. 40 years of peace are judge, and 40 years of peace, so 7 years of oppression. Who is this judge? Gideon. Gideon is also our middle judge to a certain way because it fits kind of a gapping point in things as we think about how Israel is behaving and then how Israel will behave. An army is chosen for Gideon from 10,000, reduced to 300, based on what behavior? What's the metric that is used to identify this? The way they drink water. And from my own presence at that very stream, I can guarantee you I would not be chosen because I stuck my head into that stream as deep it would go and almost got entirely into it because of how hot it was that day. I was not alone in that behavior. I think in our tour group, nobody chose the army route that day. We were all into cooling off. And so it was a brutally hot day. I think you can probably kind of contemplate, there's a couple things going on. I want to make a quick point. Often when we look at that story, we think that God there is picking the very best of those men because he needs those very best. But realize that that is not actually what God needs. God doesn't need any of those things. He has already demonstrated his capacity to solve any of these problems through any number of means. And so, yes, these men were the most alert, most participant, for the event and prepared and all those things and useful on the earthly level. But from God's perspective, he could have done the same thing with a pebble. Oh, and by the way, he would later in these stories as we get to think about David. One stone is able to solve the same kind of problem. And so it's just a method, if you will, as opposed to being the method. Our next judge is not given so much specifically to a tribe, but our location there is Shechem. This judge has 70 brothers, and he hired people to murder all of his brothers except one. Which judge is this? Abimelech. All right, they're going in order. You might figure this part out. But you think about this. Do you want that king, that boss, that hired people to kill all of his brothers? Independent of how good you think those brothers are. This should reevaluate our perception of the judges as a whole. Like clearly, we're no longer dealing with people who have the same morals that we want for ourselves. Now that problem might be us. That problem could be them. The problem could be we're post the cross. But there's a lot of things going on in our kind of appreciation for these events. 23-year period of judgeship. This next judge arose to save Israel, but we don't get a lot of information about them. Tola is the next judge in sequence. Don't get a lot of facts. That's another interesting aspect about some of what we call the minor judges, just because there's less written about them. They're just there. They engage in their work. We don't necessarily always even get an area in which they did so, but we do see those events taking place. Our next judge will engage in this role for 22 years. In their interesting details, they had 30 sons that rode 30 donkeys, and they claimed leadership of 30 cities. Who's this? Jair, right? I want you to think about that again for a second. And what it would mean to have, like what's being owned by 30 sons, 30 donkeys, 30 cities. What does that tell you about him? Remember the context of the world around this time in Canaan. How do you get to have 30 cities and 30 sons?
A lot of wives.
A lot of wives are going to go with some math there, at least a couple there. And start doing the math to math that one out. Are these areas where you could kind of like negotiate into wealth or have a successful business and kind of develop a new product and get crypto wealth or Apple wealth because you made a phone before anyone else did? This guy is a Genghis Khan light. He's got some power because of whom he is. He's either crafty or strong. Because that's how much nearly all of them are. And yet he's still judging Israel. And it doesn't actually even give us the full level of details for that, but over the course of 22 years. Donkeys become a little bit more emblem of royalty at this point as well. And so this is saying, hey, he's got wealth. He's riding donkeys. They're not walking. Their feet aren't touching the ground. They're elevated in this regard. Our next judge is going to be working against the Ammonites. Do so for 18 years. Mainly deal with Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. And will be doing so for 6 years. Who is this individual? It's another one of those problematic stories that has events at the end of it that make us kind of do a gut check. What's their name? I heard it faintly there. Jephthah is the one who makes this rash vow. Said he would sacrifice the first thing that comes from his house if God will deliver Ammon victorious. And daughter that first comes out of his house. The text says he sacrifices her. It's one of those passages where our emotions struggle with what the passage implies. And so if you read through historical commentaries going all the way back as far as I read into the 500s AD about this particular story, not only amongst Christ followers but also amongst Jews, they are all struggling with the implication. And they're all generally offering alternatives as maybe could-bes. And they're kind of all in the same nebulous space. Well, maybe it means celibacy, or maybe it means service, or maybe it was for a limited time. Maybe there's some way he could get out of it. But they all also generally include the other end of it going, as much as we want it to be that way, it says sacrifice, and everywhere else that word is used in context, it doesn't mean a vow. It means exactly as you would think it would mean. And it highlights something interesting in this, because the same word for sacrifice that's used here was also used in the history of Israel with another child. Same words in play there. And that person goes to the Mount of Sacrifice, fully intending to accept the outcome. The New Testament gives us insight and says, hey, you know what? I knew one way or the other it was going to be okay. Either God would provide a sacrifice or he would raise my son. That tells us a little bit of the difference between the character of Jephthah and others. Abram in this case. And maybe where our character finds its stretching, if you will, to mature in the right direction. Are we stretching towards resurrection or stretching towards excuses? Because our reading through history, everyone that I've read, and even I've thought, there's got to be another way. Got to be another way. But maybe we need to be stretching towards resurrection instead of trying to find a way out. Next judge will do so for 7 years. And this judge will have 30 sons who are given marriage outside the family spaces. In this case, you're thinking outside mostly of Israel. Who's this judge? We call them a minor judge. Ibzan or Ibzan. Hey, look, here's a rule about Hebrew names as translated into English. If you make an attempt to pronounce it, you are correct. That's the rule. If you want to try to figure out the Hebrew pronunciation of the word, realize that that's not always what makes it into English. A lot of times those Hebrew words get kind of moved into other terms. And so look, if you're close, you're getting all the gold stars because you made the attempt. Next judge does so for 10 years. Not a lot of detail for him. Who we got? Elon or Elon. Maybe eventually his descendant will make the Tesla. Who knows? Next judge that comes along is going to do so for 8 years. There's going to be a repeat of interesting details in that we get to see that they had 40 sons, 30 grandsons that ride on, wait for it, 70 donkeys. It's like we're in the Price is Right mode here. Who's this? Yeah, this is Abdon. When you think about, again, this is trying to demonstrate their power or their wealth. It's a reflection of Old Testament statements that talk about your children being your value, your inheritance, your might. And in the first century world, it was often more valuable to have a large family than it would be to have a lot of other things. They did not value possessions in the same way that maybe we do. Because 70 workers meant you can accomplish quite a bit, or 70 warriors meant you could take quite a bit. Next judge is going to be focused on the Philistines, mostly dealing with Dan, 20 years of judgeship. Kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Delilah would entice him, tell him how to get his strength. Eventually tells her and loses his strength. Then prays for strength to kill more Philistines in his death than when he was alive. Samson. Most definitely not Clark Kent of the Bible. Just here, no, he's certainly strong, but he is no Superman and no superhero in that sense. Next judge that's identified for us in the text comes through again, Philistines. 40 years of judgeship, but it moves out of judges. Who's this judge? Noted in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and following. Eli is correct. Eli is this judge in the text. And then we have one more judge who comes in, 20 years of judgeship. Years of peace is his entire lifetime. We have Samuel. Samuel, that's all the way through the closing parts of the text. Samuel is notable because he is dedicated by God, or to God by his mother Hannah. It takes place at the area where the tabernacle is being situated. Eventually will anoint Saul as king, and later anoints David to be king as a supplanter to Saul. That's it for this morning because the clock is up. So thank you everyone for your participation, and hopefully this has been enriching your perspective of the history of God's people. Thanks everybody.